you suggested at the end. Do you have any data that prove that then you can increase biodiversity in these such systems?
We don't have any data directly to answer your question, but most organisms live in the margins. There is a lot of research going on at the moment in the UK, and I dare say across the whole of Europe, about how best to manage margins for wildlife. So if, say, 60-70% of your biodiversity lives in margins, then effectively you can get 60 or 70% of the way there by managing your margins correctly. We showed a couple of years ago with yellowhammer, one of the nice farmland birds, that if you manage the margins properly, the birds don't want to go into the crop at all, and they will get all of their food from within the margins. So I think, especially if we're moving towards low-till, no-till systems with precision agriculture in terms of where you put your chemicals, then that will get us almost all the way that we need to go if we can find ways of persuading farmers to cooperate across their borders and do the right thing for the right location, and if we can monitor the biodiversity within the margins, and so that we can know whether or not the farmers are doing the right thing. So I don't think, the data is there. It hasn't been specifically addressed in the way that you asked for, but the data is there to be able to show that, I think.
Take another question, please. Yes, Jean-Charles. Oh, sorry, Anne's got the microphone first. Anne Buckingham.
Okay, thank you. Anne Buckingham from the UK Crop Protection Association. Tim, I was interested in your idea that the difference between how farmland could be managed in the west and the east of England. Whilst I can see that concept of managing some areas intensively and leaving other areas for wildlife might work in some parts of the world, do you think that that's a realistic option in a country such as the United Kingdom, where you have a population living in rural areas? Do you think that it's really ever going to be acceptable socially to say, well, we'll have all the biodiversity in one part of the country and we'll farm intensively in another?
So at one level, yes, because effectively at one level that's what we already do. So the east side of the country is much more intensive than the west side of the country. So I think, especially if you go towards the intensively managed landscapes, having their spared land properly managed for biodiversity, I could see East Anglia increasing biodiversity if it was managed intensively, but also properly for the biodiversity in the way that the agri-environment schemes currently don't. But what I'm effectively suggesting is that there are a hierarchy of levels. So within a field, you've got your margin, which you can manage for biodiversity, and your cropland. Between farms, you've got some farms that can be organic, some farms that can be conventional. Between regions, you've got regions that naturally have high biodiversity and low productivity, and regions which naturally have high productivity and low biodiversity. And so from the societal perspective, it is how you balance all of those things together. And intrinsically, if you're in a low productivity area, we should be encouraging you to manage your biodiversity, because you've got more of it than you'll get yield. Whereas if you're in a high productivity area, we should be putting the policy processes in, the subsidies in, or whatever, for you to produce and also farm the biodiversity around your margins. So it's not a matter of let's convert East Anglia to a huge prairie. It is let's make the most of East Anglia in terms of being able to produce its wheat, its barley, because that's naturally what it does, rather than try and convert East Anglia into a high biodiversity region, because we will never do that, and it will come at a huge cost in terms of our productivity. So I don't think it's not as bleak as I said. It's a kind of nuanced argument, but it does make sense to maintain the high productivity areas as high productivity, because we can't convert them into Amazonian rainforest levels of biodiversity.
I think we still have time for a couple more questions. Jean-Charles Bouquet.
Jean-Charles Bouquet from the French Crop Protection Association. Very good presentations regarding the impact of different kind of agriculture on biodiversity. But as you know, within the European regulation, we will be asked as a crop protection industry to think about indicators which are much more specific to the plant protection product, the pesticides. And based on your both experiences, Do you have any recommendation to us based on what you have done, which will help us to find one or two basic indicators which can characterize the impact of crop protection product on biodiversity? Because we talk about birds, we can talk about bees, we can talk about thousands of life organisms. So short list, two indicators if you have.
Yeah, that's a lot of people are thinking about that already, but the systems are so complex that, for example, in Germany they had the idea to measure biodiversity just by the extent of hedgerows in a landscape or on a farm, but hedgerows is not biodiversity. So I have no answer for that one. You can count birds, but you can select birds. Maybe Tim has some better ideas.
No. No, I think the issue is that the easy things to assess are animals that move. And, you know, I know with my own studies on birds, you can wipe out all of the insects on a farm and leave them in one tiny corner, and your yellowhammers will find that corner. So actually, you will get the wrong impression by looking at whether or not you've got yellowhammers on the farm than whether you've got insects on the farm. And different groups of insects will respond in different way to pesticides of various forms. In terms of the easiest thing, I suspect, wearing my Professor of Population Ecology hat, the most direct way would be to look at the soil biodiversity ecosystem. And there are various molecular methods that are readily available now where you can just shove things in a test tube, mash them up, and then get a list of species out of it. And understanding how the pesticide use flows into soil biodiversity, because that's there and then. It's not confounded by what's moving around the landscape. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing, we are certainly involved in developing ways of remote sensing and assessing, using aerial photographs, the vegetation communities in margins. And I think if you've got a healthy, biodiverse vegetation community in a margin, then that will probably be a pretty good indicator of whether or not there is too much chemical in the environment. And we're getting to the point where taking a photo, using an aerial photo, running it through a computer program will give you an answer in seconds for a landscape scale thing. So that might actually end up being a useful correlate proxy of what you want.
Okay, I think we've time for the last question, because I see we've just gone past the time allotted.
Friedhelm, I don't like to get the last question here, but anyway, I would like to deepen a little bit this point, because being politically successful, you need 1, maximum 3 convincing arguments. Not telling the big complex story. It's impossible it work. Nevertheless, what I have seen in the past is, and we in the pesticides industry are always the focus, say, reducing pesticide, and that will help biodiversity. The learning is quite clear, it's not true. So what we can offer for the solution of tomorrow, having all this discussion in the European Parliament, in the Council, in the Commission, wherever it goes around, what is the one key messages? What is a part to say we should go out with our discussion around the pesticides area and going for marginal strips, land management for some specific species, knowing very well managing one species might be a threat to other species, and then we are again back to a complex world. Is there an advice from you?
No, my advice is that, you know, apart from pesticide residues seeping into the groundwater and, you know, broad environmental effects, largely it probably doesn't matter what we do so much in the middle of fields if we manage the margins right. So it doesn't bother me that we're reducing biodiversity in the middle of the fields if there are refuges for that biodiversity elsewhere. And we need, if we've got refuges for biodiversity, then inherently there is a higher risk that crops will be hit by pests and pathogens. So that, in a sense, calls out, if we want the productivity, we will have to carry on using chemicals in a targeted and efficient way.
Okay, thanks very much for those enlightening questions and the replies from our guest speakers today. With that, I close this first session. Thank you.